Hi, and welcome back. Today, our topic is ethic of care. So when we talk about an ethic of care, we're talking about the idea that um, women and men think differently about moral issues, and that women take a more care approach to decisions based on morality. So the idea that men and women think differently has traditionally been used to subjugate one to the other. One is better or one is worse than the other. And this has been around for a long time, right? Aristotle believed that women were not as rational as men. Kant believed that women lacked civil personality. Rousseau said men and women possess different virtues, and men's fit them for leadership, while women's fit them more for home and hearth. We saw, even in our recent past, in the 1960s, the 1970s, the women's movement really rejected the notion of differences between men and women. We saw big efforts by the National Organization of Women to increase women's rights. We saw the attempted passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which inevitably did not pass. And so we've sort of seen a difference in how people are thinking about men and women's thinking capabilities. Now, so we went from men and women think differently to maybe there are no differences to more recently, maybe they do think differently, but maybe it's not a matter of one being better or worse than the other. Maybe it's just different, right? So I think that's where we're going to go today as we talk about men and women's issues. So I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about a scientist, social scientist named Lawrence Kohlberg that you may have heard of if you've taken a psychology class or a sociology class. And then I'm going to go forward to a social scientist by the name of Carol Gilligan. So let's go back to Kohlberg for a minute. Kohlberg was a stage theorist, right? So the idea that as we develop as human beings, we're doing so in stages, that we aren't developing right away as we come out of the womb. We aren't the same when we're 2 months old as compared to 22 or 82, but that this is a lifelong process of development. So other stage theorists might be people like Sigmund Freud or Erik Erikson or Jean Piaget. But Kohlberg is a stage theorist and really focused on the theories surrounding moral development. How do we think about moral issues? And is that different from when we are younger to when we are teenagers to when we are adults? And so he developed different stages of this process. And while there are multiple stages, I'm going to break that down into the three main components, even though there might be stages within those three components. But for our purposes here, it's just important to know that there are three main stages of development: the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional stage. If you were reasoning at a pre-conventional level, you would base your moral decision-making upon self-interest, upon the idea of reducing punishment, reducing pain. You would think about consequences. If you were reasoning at the conventional level, you would think more about one's roles and duties and obligations and what society says is appropriate or not appropriate. And if you're reasoning at a post-conventional level, you're thinking about bigger universal principles of humanity, of justice. So you can see that they're quite different, going from less sophisticated to probably what we would consider more sophisticated, as Kohlberg thought as well. He believed that a pre-conventional level was a less mature or less sophisticated way of reasoning about moral issues than a post-conventional level of moral reasoning might be. So the idea is that you move up from pre to conventional to post throughout your lifetime as you mature, as you gain insight. So Kohlberg did a lot of studying, and how he would determine if people were reasoning at a pre-conventional or conventional or post-conventional stage of development was by offering them the dilemma of Heinz. And so he would tell them that there was a man named Heinz whose wife was very sick with a form of cancer that radium could help, and this radium happened to be made in the same town that Heinz lived in. However, Heinz did not have enough money to pay for the drug, and he went to all his friends looking for money to be able to buy this drug for his wife. He could only manage to get about half of the money he needed, so he went to the druggist and he asked if he could have the drug and pay later or make payments, and the druggist said no. And so later, Heinz broke into the drugstore and stole the drug for his wife. Now, the dilemma is, and the question that Kohlberg would ask individuals was, should Heinz have done that? And he wasn't really looking for a yes or no answer. He was looking for the why should Heinz have done that, because that would tell him if the individual was reasoning at a conventional or a post-conventional level of moral reasoning. So if, for instance, someone said, no, Heinz should not have stole the drug for his wife because he could get in trouble and go to jail, Kohlberg would be able to see that that person would be reasoning at the pre-conventional level, thinking about consequences and punishments of behavior. Or let's say that the person said, yes, Heinz should have stole the drug for his wife because that's what a good husband would do. Kohlberg would be able to determine that that person is reasoning at a conventional level of reasoning, one where they are looking at duties and obligations and social conventions, and so that is what a good husband would do. A good husband, the role of a good husband, would have an obligation and a duty to his wife to steal the drug for his wife. Or maybe an individual says, yes, Heinz should have stole the drug for his wife because the value of a human life is greater than the value of the cost of the drug. And so you can see that that's a post-conventional way of reasoning, really looking at bigger universal principles of humanity and justice. And so when Kohlberg could determine these levels, he could determine that people were more mature or less mature in their reasoning capabilities about moral issues. Right? And so I want you to hold on to that thought for a minute, because I also want to tell you about a philosopher named Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan believed that women and men think differently about moral issues, but that women are not necessarily inferior to men, right? So if you were to give the same dilemma that I was just talking about with Lawrence Kohlberg to males and females, what you would find, what Carol Gilligan would find, was that there would be more men reasoning at a post-conventional level on big, abstract, universal principles, and more women reasoning at the conventional level of social responsibilities and duties and obligations. But Carol Gilligan said that doesn't make women inferior to men, as Kohlberg might suggest, but that they just think differently about moral situations, that females are responding to the personal aspects of the situation, generally not ignoring the details, and so looking at the relationships and the roles and the obligations and the duties, whereas males might see a conflict between life and property and looking at basic abstract principles of justice and humanity in general, appealing more to impersonal principles that would sort of take away the details that would give each situation its special flavor. So women thinking of the details, men not necessarily. But again, neither that one of those are inferior or superior to the other, they're just different from one another. If you used Lawrence Kohlberg's reasoning, he would say that if you're reasoning at the conventional level, you are less mature and perhaps an inferior reasoner about moral issues. So Kohlberg and Gilligan are disagreeing about this notion. Gilligan's basic argument is that women's basic moral orientation is caring for others. Hence the title of this unit, which is The Ethic of Care. She would argue that women have this notion that their ethical reasoning capabilities come from the point of caring for others, of looking at those personal details and realizing that personal relationships are very important. So we ask ourselves, is it true that men and women think differently? And if it is true, does it matter? Maybe there are differences between men and women, but maybe those aren't as dramatic as we think. Maybe it's a difference in emphasis rather than a difference in fundamental values. Right? We all know women who think in principle and men who think in the ethic of care. So obviously, men and women don't inhabit two completely different universes. And we know that men and women can see each other's points. Gilligan would just say that these are typical perspectives, right? Even though she recognizes that maybe not every man or every woman thinks the way that she's describing, but that they are generalizations and typical ways of thinking. So, what could account maybe for such differences between the sexes? Is it nature? Is it nurture? And we always have these arguments as to, are we the way we are because we were born a certain way, we're genetically predisposed to believe something, or are we the way we are because of our experiences that we've had and the way we've been nurtured? And so we always look to nature versus nurture, and usually it's likely a combination of both, right? Perhaps in this case, it's social roles, right? That there is some kind of psychological conditioning that girls are retrieving and receiving because they are girls. They're assigned to a particular role because our society tells us what it means to be feminine and, of course, what it means to be masculine as well. So girls are conditioned to have this nurturing nature about them. Of course, there's always the idea that it is instinctual, right? The theory of evolutionary psychology says that these psychological factors are really products of natural selection, that because we need to continue the species, we develop certain psychological factors to make that happen. So males need to impregnate as many as they can because they can father thousands, but women can only have one baby every 9 months, which would likely mean that women are going to invest more heavily in each child and likely choose partners that are willing to stick around and make a similar investment. Because of what they can do, their psychological factors evolve with them. So both of them are interesting, and probably both of them have some kind of validity when talking about differences between the sexes and moral judgments. But really the question is, why does this matter, right? Why does it matter if men and women think differently, if in fact they do? It was an interesting story about the Supreme Court of the United States, because if moral decision-making matters between men and women, is it important for us to have both men and women on the Supreme Court if they're thinking differently about moral issues, which a lot of times moral issues are the issues that are coming up in front of the Supreme Court. So currently we have 3 women on the Supreme Court. Should there be 4? Should there be 5? Should there be none? And so there are interesting questions to think about. If men and women do think differently about these kinds of issues, does it matter to us? And so when we think about traditional theories like Kant, for example, which says we act from obligation or we act from duty, it's a little bit difficult when you think about a loving parent acting from duty, right? Loving parents don't act from duty. Loving parents act for motives other than duty. And that's really what Carol Gilligan is talking about, that there are explanations for why people may do the things that they do other than simply self-interest, which would be egoism, or utilitarianism, making the most people happy, or even